Good morning. As you know, schools must follow a food-based menu planning approach and produce enough food for each child to offer each child the quantities established in the final rule. These quantities vary depending on the age grade group that is being served. On this slide, you'll see a review of the 5 components a school food authority must offer for lunch, as well as the age grade groups that schools may serve. Offer versus serve allows students to decline some of the food offered in a reimbursable lunch or breakfast. The goals of OVS are to reduce food waste and also to promote students to choose the foods they would like to eat. Senior high schools, or grades 9 through 12, must participate in offer versus serve, while schools below the senior high level may participate in offer versus serve at the discretion of the school food authority. Lastly, for the National School Lunch Program, schools must offer daily the 5 food components noted on the previous slide. Under OVS, students must be allowed to decline 2 items at lunch, except that students must select at least half a cup of either the fruit or vegetable component. If a student selects a fruit and vegetable as 2 of their 3 components, one of them must be the full required amount based on the age or grade group being served. An example of this would be if the students are in high school, the full required amount would be 1 full cup. We'll now go on to our second component of lunch. We'll now go through each component of lunch, starting with fruit. You already know that schools must offer fruits daily as part of the lunch menu. Fruits may be offered fresh, frozen without sugar, canned in light syrup, water, or fruit juice, or dry to meet the fruit requirement. A final rule published in January now permanently allows frozen fruit with sugar. So you may use frozen fruit, of course, without sugar, and also with sugar both now and moving forward. Basically, in allowing this, USDA responded to input from sponsors, school food authorities, and also manufacturers who really have not been able to reformulate some frozen fruit products to maintain an acceptable product. Dried fruit is sometimes processed with sugar to keep the pieces from sticking together, and so this is considered allowable. Only pasteurized, full-strength, 100% fruit juice may be used. The amount of 100% fruit juice offered must be no more than half of the volume of total fruit that students are allowed to select each week. This is the case because it lacks dietary fiber, and when consumed in excess, can contribute extra calories. Schools should always offer fresh fruit whenever possible. Also, diluted juice is not permitted. And as just a reminder, fruit strips and fruit snacks are not creditable either. This slide here shows the section of the lunch meal pattern chart for fruit. You can see that the minimum weekly requirement at lunch for fruit is 2½ cups for grades K through 5, as well as grades K through 8 and 6 through 8. And a minimum of 5 cups per week for grades 9 through 12. Grades K through 5 and grades K through 6 through 8 have minimum daily requirements of the ½ a cup, as you can see in the parentheses, and grades 9 through 12 must be offered a minimum of 1 cup of fruit per day. Keep in mind, the 1 cup must be offered or be made available for students to take, but under OVS, students may select only a ½ cup serving to meet the reimbursable meal criteria. Okay, the fruit component is credited based on the volume served, except for dried fruit. 1/4 cup of dried fruit would count as a ½ a cup of fruit. It's recommended you continue to use the food buying guide, which USDA updates as needed. Be sure to use the updated separation of vegetable and fruit section of the food buying guide that was updated about a year ago in January. USDA has changed some website addresses recently, and so the one that you see on the slide will take you to the correct page. Portions smaller than 1/8 of a cup cannot be used to credit towards the required amount of fruit offered to students. Now let's focus a bit on juice, as it is offered as part of the fruit component. An offering of fruits or vegetables is defined as the amount a child is able to select at a given meal, regardless of the number of options or variety of fruits or vegetables. Remember, juice cannot be credited to meet more than 1/2 of the fruits component offered throughout the week. Here we have an example. A school offers a half a cup of peaches, a half a cup of applesauce, a half a cup of oranges, and a half a cup of juice every day. Students are instructed to select a total of a cup. Is the school within the weekly juice limit? Throughout the entire week, 2.5 cups of juice is offered and 5 cups of fruit is offered. 2.5 cups of juice divided by 5 cups of fresh fruit is 50%. The school does not exceed the weekly juice limit, so yes, this example is considered allowable. You can read more about this in question 41 of USDA's Q&A document for the National School Lunch and School Breakfast Program. Okay, so for menu planning purposes, juice may be offered every day if students are allowed to select 1 cup of fruit, and no more than half a cup of the fruit that they select may be in the form of juice. So students will be permitted to select 2 1/2 cup portions of fruit and a half a cup of fruit and a half a cup of juice. Students would not be permitted to select 2 1/2 cup portions of juice, as this would exceed 50% of the fruit offered throughout the week. This will work easiest in high school, where students must select a full cup. Although it is not required for grades K through 8 to take 1 full cup of fruit, schools may choose to do so or to allow this just as a way to increase their fruit consumption. Okay, on this slide we have another scenario that meets USDA's requirement for juice in lower grades. Students may select only a half a cup of fruit each day, which is 2.5 cups total throughout the week, and a half a cup of juice is offered only twice per week, which means the weekly volume of juice a student may select is just 1 cup. This is allowable because the weekly volume of juice, which is 1 cup, is not more than half the weekly volume of total fruit, which is 2.5 cups. For those RCCIs, which operate 7 days per week, offering juice on 3 of those days is permissible. All right, the next component of lunch that we will discuss is vegetables. Fresh, frozen, or canned vegetables and dried beans and peas or legumes may be offered to meet the vegetable requirement. All veggies are credited based on their volume as served, except that 1 cup of leafy greens counts as a half a cup of vegetables, and tomato paste and puree are credited based on calculated volume of the whole food equivalency. Although vegetable juices are less commonly offered in schools than fruit juices, pasteurized full-strength vegetable juice may also be used to meet no more than 1/2 of the vegetable's components. Full-strength vegetable juice blends that contain veggies from the same subgroup may contribute toward that vegetable subgroup. However, vegetable juice blends containing vegetables from more than one subgroup may contribute to the additional vegetable subgroup. Cooked dried beans or peas and legumes may be counted as either a veggie or as a meat alternate, but not as both in the same meal. Like juice, 1/8 of a cup is the minimum amount of vegetables that may be credited towards the daily vegetable requirement. And again, be sure to use the updated separation of vegetable and fruit section of your food buying guide, updated in January of 2013. The updated information can be found by using the link that's provided on this slide. Okay. As with fruits, vegetables have both a daily minimum requirement and weekly requirements, which you will take a look at in more detail on the next slide. Vegetable offerings at lunch over the course of the week must include the vegetable subgroups provided on this slide. You will find the subgroup requirements in the meal pattern chart that you can also find on pairs. There is also a catch-all category titled Additional Vegetables to Reach the Total in the meal pattern chart. Those can come from any subgroup to meet the weekly total. Here you see a snapshot of the vegetable component on the meal chart pattern, or the meal pattern chart. The idea here is to give children access to a variety of vegetables over the course of the week, and in particular to ensure that the variety includes specific groups of vegetables that are encouraged in the dietary guidelines for Americans. The other vegetable subgroup is a distinct grouping of food items as classified by the 2010 dietary guidelines. One thing to note is that schools can substitute vegetables from the dark green, red, orange, or beans and peas categories for other vegetables if they desire, but they may not substitute starchy vegetables for other vegetables. The additional vegetables needed to meet the weekly total listed across the bottom row are permitted to come from any of the 5 categories. All right, before we move on from fruits and vegetables, I just want to take some time to review the offering and crediting of pureed fruits and veggies. USDA's Memo 10, SP 10/2014 goes into detail about crediting fruit smoothies both at lunch and breakfast. Just to summarize quickly, fruit and milk are credited in smoothies prepared by local operators. Commercially prepared smoothies may not credit toward the fruit component, and the fruit in smoothies counts as juice and counts towards the weekly juice limit. You can also refer to USDA's Meal Pattern Questions and Answers document, SP 10/2013, for additional information on this. Okay, our next component of lunch is grains. And of course, the big change for the upcoming school year is that all grains offered during the school week must meet the whole grain rich criteria in order to be creditable. In order for grains to be considered whole grain rich, they must be 100% whole grain or contain a blend of whole grain meal and or flour and enriched meal and or flour, of which at least 50% is whole grain. We'll be looking at grains in some extra detail because of this upcoming change. Just to be clear, whole grain rich does not mean that the grain item must be 100% whole grain. Whole grain rich means that a grain item must contain at least 50% whole grain, and the rest of the product or flour blend must be enriched. This month, USDA released Memo SP 47/2014, which pointed out the challenge many schools are facing regarding the preparation and storage of 100% whole grain rich pastas. The USDA is prepared to offer continued flexibility in this area for those school food authorities that remove popular pasta items that, when produced with whole grain rich pasta, did not hold well or were not accepted by students, and the school food authority has demonstrated hardship in obtaining acceptable whole grain rich pastas for that item. So, if acceptable products for previously offered items are not available or accepted by students, the state agency may approve the school food authority's request to continue to serve enriched pasta during school year 2014-15 and school year 2015-16 if necessary. The flexibility is only available until acceptable products are available and identified, and while the school food authority can demonstrate a continued negative impact. The whole grain resource for the National School Lunch Program and School Breakfast Program is an excellent resource to use when working with your grains. It provides an in-depth look at the whole grain rich criteria for school meals. It updates and expands the previous whole grain resource from the Healthier U.S. School Challenge application kit, which now applies to all school meal programs. It also includes exercises on identifying products to meet the whole grain rich criteria and calculation examples for you to practice with. Here you see a chart that briefly summarizes the weekly and daily grain requirements. You will see on USDA's meal pattern charts that they continue to show a weekly range for the grains requirement, which was based on the original idea of having minimum and maximums for the week. However, USDA has extended that flexibility and made it permanent, both for grains and meat alternates. So really the maximums are just there for the meal planner's guidance at this point. If for example, you find that your weekly menu exceeds the maximum calories, you may want to take a look at your grains or meat alternate and consider reducing the number of items to bring down the calories. So now that all of your grains must be whole grain rich, it is helpful to take a look at some examples of whole grains. This will be very helpful information when reading labels to determine if a product is a whole grain rich item. Your first clue is seeing the word whole before or within the name of the flour, such as whole wheat flour or white whole wheat. We can recognize some whole grains simply because it's in the form that they come. An example would be brown rice, another would be wild rice, and oatmeal. Some others you might see are cracked wheat, crushed wheat, and entire wheat flour, and some other indicators are grains that contain berries or groats. There's more examples, and you can find these in your whole grain resource on page 6. Here are some examples of products that would not be considered whole grain. Notice none of these say whole, which would indicate to us that they are whole grains. Page 7 of the whole grain resource provides a chart of these examples and a lot more for your reference. Some grains we might see on the label really aren't that clear as far as whether they are whole grains or not. Stone ground, for example, describes the process used for making the flour or meal. It would be suggested to look for the word whole in combination with stone ground in the ingredient statement. Program operators would need to obtain additional information when they see the ingredients or descriptors provided on this slide in order to document meal pattern compliance. Compare manufacturer documentation with ingredient statements and verify that crediting calculations on the documentation are accurate. Once again, for more information on products that often do not meet the whole grain rich criteria, you want to see page 7 of the whole grain resource. So now that we have some background on what a whole grain is, we want to look into more detail at how we can identify items that meet this criteria. There are 2 requirements for a grain item to credit in the school nutrition program. First, it must meet the portion size requirements for the grain's components. Secondly, they must also meet at least one of the criteria listed below. List a whole grain as the first ingredient, list a whole grain as the first grain ingredient in mixed dishes like pizza, contain at least 8 grams of whole grain per serving, include the FDA whole grain health claim, have a valid CN or child nutrition label crediting ounce equivalents, or have the recipe or manufacturer documentation verifying that the total weight or whole grain ingredients exceeds the weight of the non-whole grain ingredients. We're going to come back to this slide in a few minutes, but first we'll walk through the first part of the requirement. So for the first part, the item must meet the portion size requirements, which are measured in ounce equivalents. We can determine this very simply by using Exhibit A, which, just to quickly note, is on page 23 of your whole grain resource. You can determine it by looking at the CN label if the product has one, or we can calculate based on the creditable grains in the product. So we will look at each of these 3 ways in some more detail. Just so you know, Exhibit A is also located on pairs. All right. You want to determine the group in which your product belongs. Some examples belonging to each group are, for Group A, breadcrumbs, breadsticks, savory crackers, croutons, and pretzels. For Group B, breads, buns, sweet crackers, pizza crust, tortillas, and tortilla chips. Group C, cookies, cornbread, pancakes, and pie crusts. For Group D, donuts, cereal bars, and muffins. Group E, cereal bars or cookies with nuts, fruits and chocolate, and French toast. Group H, pasta, rice, and cooked cereal. And Group I would be your ready-to-eat dry cereal. We're going to go ahead and go through an example where we use Exhibit A to calculate the ounce equivalents for a hamburger bun. We have a 60-gram hamburger bun. We determine that hamburger buns are in Group B. For Group B, 1 ounce equivalent is 28 grams. So we take the weight of our item, which is 60 grams, and divide that by 28 grams to get 2.1 ounce equivalents. Since we always round down, our answer becomes 2 ounce equivalents. Here we have 2 additional examples. We have 1 cup of cooked pasta or spaghetti. Pasta falls in Group H. For Group H, a half a cup of cooked pasta is 1 ounce equivalent, and because we have 1 full cup of cooked pasta, we have 2 ounce equivalents. Our second example is round, ready-to-eat breakfast cereal, and we have 1.1 ounce. Breakfast cereal that's dry, I should say, is in Group I. For Group I, 1 cup or 1 ounce is 1 ounce equivalent, so our 1.1 ounce serving is 1.1 ounce equivalent. Again, we always round down to the nearest quarter, so our answer is 1 ounce equivalent. Another way we can determine ounce equivalent for grains is by getting the information from a valid CN or child nutrition label. A CN label shows how the product contributes toward food-based meal pattern requirements. Manufacturers can choose to apply for a CN label. Additionally, it can be decided at the local level that school food authorities will require CN labels from its vendors. When using a CN label, you want to look for ounce equivalents to determine what an item contributes to the grain component for the current meal pattern regulations. If you notice a CN label states bread or bread alternate, this means the product meets the previous program requirements for grains and breads. And in this case, you would need to refer to the nutrition label and ingredients list for more information to determine whether the product is considered whole grain rich. For more information on CN labels, you can visit their website that we provided on this slide. This here is an example of a CN label. Simply seeing this on an items package indicates that it does contribute to the meal pattern requirements. We see, indicated by that red oval, that this product contains an ounce equivalent of whole grain rich grains. You'll also notice this label does not clearly state ounce equivalents, but rather it states serving. We still recognize that they're referring to an ounce equivalent of whole grain rich grains. And another way to determine ounce equivalents is to do a calculation based on the creditable grains in the product. The way you would do this is to get the information from the manufacturer of the product. The other time you would use this method is when you are making an in-house recipe and need to determine the number of ounce equivalents per serving. So you will divide the grams of creditable grains by 16 to get the number of ounce equivalents for groups A through G in Exhibit A. For Group H, you will divide by 28 grams to get ounce equivalent grains. For Group I, which are your ready-to-eat cereals, they are reported by volume or by weight. Another point I want to mention is that USDA has a list of non-creditable grains that do not credit toward the meal pattern and cannot exceed 2% of the product formula. Some examples of these would be oat fiber, bran, germ, modified food starch, and cornstarch. You can find more of these on page 7 of your whole grain resource, and I will also point out a label containing non-creditable grains in an upcoming slide. Now I will turn the presentation over to Jenny Edmondson.